Hello, yes. The irony and redundancy is not lost on me doing a summary video on a summary video. But this is an exercise for me, as much as it might be for you if that's why you decided to watch. Because this video is one of the most magnificent pieces of content on YouTube. I am 100% confident in asserting that. And I'm not talking about this video you're watching right now, but the video that I'm talking about, Ray Dalio's Economic Machine. It's unbelievable. It does an exceptional job at explaining a extremely misunderstood function of our world, which is the economy. Okay, so with that, let's get into it.
How the economic machine works in 30 minutes. The economy works like a simple machine, but many people don't understand it, or they don't agree on how it works, and this has led to a lot of needless economic suffering. I feel a deep sense of responsibility to share my simple but practical economic template. Though it's unconventional.
And why is Ray qualified to do this, his brief economic template? Well, he's the founder of Bridgewater, which is one of the, or if not the biggest hedge fund on the planet. And a hedge fund is just a bunch of rich people who pool their money together to give it to a money manager who then allocates it into the market. Lots of fancy finance speak in this fucking world. Ray Dalio is one of the richest men on the planet and therefore one of the richest men in history. He's deeply thoughtful. He writes about a whole manner of topics outside of finance and investing as well. And in sort of like true financial wizard fashion, attributes a lot of things he learns from outside of finance to inside finance. Personally, I think it's a little bit of survivorship bias, like touch of BS. But nonetheless, like Ray Dalio is magnificent. His book Principles is fantastic. And Ray is now coming into the twilight of his career, as it were. I think he recently stepped down as CEO of Bridgewater, and he's moving his resources, his time towards education. He also has a fucking brilliant outlook on the history of bubbles, which is also fantastic. But anyway, that's who Ray Dalio is. Let's continue.
It has helped me to anticipate and to sidestep the global financial crisis, and it has worked well for me for over 30 years. Let's begin. Though the economy might seem complex, it works in a simple, mechanical way. It's made up of a few simple parts and a lot of simple transactions that are repeated over and over again a zillion times. These transactions are above all else driven by human nature, and they create three main forces that drive the economy. Number one, productivity growth. Number two, the short-term debt cycle. And number three, the long-term debt cycle. We'll look at these three forces and how laying them on top of each other creates a good template for tracking economic movements and figuring out what's happening now. Let's start with the simplest part of the economy, transactions.
That right there might be the most important takeaway, that graph. It looks like a bunch of squiggly lines, and it is a bunch of squiggly lines, but the way Ray thinks about the economy is through short-term and long-term debt cycles, very cyclical way of looking at the financial markets. And just print screen this graph into your mind and let it marinate there throughout this explainer.
An economy is simply the sum of the transactions that make it up, and a transaction is a very simple thing. You make transactions all the time. Every time you buy something, you create a transaction. Each transaction consists of a buyer exchanging money or credit with a seller for goods, services, or financial assets. Credit spends just like money, so adding together the money spent and the amount of credit spent, you can know the total spending. The total amount of spending drives the economy. If you divide the amount spent by the quantity sold, you get the price. And that's it. That's a transaction. It's the building block of the economic machine. All cycles and all forces in an economy are driven by transactions. So, if we can understand transactions, we can understand the whole economy.
Millions and millions and millions and millions of these transactions is what makes up the economy. Very first principles thinking. It's It's the small barter trade that we make between each other. It's me buying the coffee this morning, that guy getting his salary and going and paying his road tax, and then the government taking that taxable income and funding someone on welfare who then goes and spends that much, who then feeds my salary, who then I go buy a coffee from. It's millions and millions and millions and millions of small little transactions. This is actually what sort of makes the world go round.
A market consists of all the buyers and all the sellers making transactions for the same thing. For example, there is a wheat market, a car market, a stock market, and markets for millions of things. An economy consists of all of the transactions in all of its markets. If you add up the total spending and the total quantity sold in all of the markets, you have everything you need to know to understand the economy. It's just that simple.
Just a quick point on this one. And obviously I should probably say, I didn't say this at the beginning, but I'm not like some fucking expert economist or anything like that. I'm just a guy who's interested in trying to understand how the world works. And from my understanding, I think what we're missing from this total spending over total quantity is that a lot of the spending actually goes unrecognized. Right, so how do you know how much is being spent? Like, obviously, there are the big macro measurements that they take. But what about in a country like Mexico, say, where there's 150 million people and tens of millions of people exist with cash? They get paid cash from their employer. They pay for their food in cash. They pay for their rent in cash. They maybe even pay their car in cash. And whatever they do to declare as income is whatever the minimum amount is so they don't get in trouble. In this sort of scenario, there's actually a lot more economic activity happening that's actually not being recognized by whatever the system is that's measuring it.
People, businesses, banks, and governments all engage in transactions the way I just described, exchanging money and credit for goods, services, and financial assets. The biggest buyer and seller is the government, which consists of two important parts: a central government that collects taxes and spends money, and a central bank, which is different from other buyers and sellers because it controls the amount of money and credit in the economy. It does this by influencing interest rates and printing new money.
And so what does influencing interest rates do? We all know what interest rates are. It's if you have a saving around the world right now, it's mostly zero. But if you have a savings account back in the day, you might have a 1.1% interest rate, which means monthly, whatever the money you had in there would grow by 1.1%. And then the next month it would grow again. This idea of compounding your interest for 1,000 years. There's a famous scene in Futurama. Fry tipped over while eating a pizza and a beer on New Year's Eve in the year 2000 and then woke up in the year 3000 and he had something like 50 cents in the bank, and he goes to the bank 1,000 years later and he's got like $1 billion. This is the power of compounding. Anyway, so the point is, now I'm going off track, but the point is with interest rates is this is how the central bank incentivizes individuals to spend or to not spend, and there's a bigger reason for that. We're going to get into it, but basically you, me, your mum, your dad, your mates, it makes borrowing money either more expensive or less expensive. There's a high interest rate. Whatever I borrow, I have to eventually pay more back to. If it's a low interest rate, whatever I borrow, I eventually, essentially in some cases, just repay that exact same amount. I have a mate, Italian guy, hopeless worker. He borrowed, while we were working together in Amsterdam, he borrowed 110% of the value of his property. Okay, so if you know, you know. But that's just an absurd situation where the Dutch government was offering just every incentive possible for people to spend to encourage participation within the economy. So this guy, he borrowed 110% of his property at essentially a 0% interest rate. Now, it wasn't actually zero, but it functionally is actually zero. So that's an example. Low interest rate encourages people to spend. The more you encourage spending, the more the money is distributed. There's microtransactions. You know, if I buy a house, that feeds a lot of construction workers, a lot of real estate people, a lot of whatever the local government is, whatever the local supermarket is, because now there's an extra person who's going to be buying their groceries there. This is like the idea of, you know, encouraging or discouraging spending. So when interest rates are really low, you can get your hands on lots of money for cheap, and vice versa when they're high.
For these reasons, as we'll see, the central bank is an important player in the flow of credit.
I just want to quickly make a point about the money printing scene there. When you print more money, it devalues all of the other money existing because there needs to be some sort of symmetry in the financial supply. Okay, so this is what inflation is. If I've got $10 and then I introduce an $11th dollar, but everything has the exact same value, well, now I've just made everything more expensive, right? Because the value of the things has remained constant, but I now have more money. And therefore, that extra dollar is liquidated across all that value. I hope that makes sense. That makes sense in my mind. But basically, the money printing, if you increase the money supply, or if you just introduce more money where it wasn't before, and it's not actually organically created through activity within the economy, this is what inflation is.
I want you to pay attention to credit. Credit is the most important part of the economy and probably the least understood. It's the most important part because it's the biggest and most volatile part. Just like buyers and sellers go to the market to make transactions, so do lenders and borrowers. Lenders usually want to make their money into more money, and borrowers usually want to buy something they can't afford, like a house or a car, or they want to invest in something like starting a business. Credit can help both lenders and borrowers get what they want. Borrowers promise to repay the amount they borrow, called principal,
Incentives.
plus an additional amount, called interest. When interest rates are high,
Incentives.
there is less borrowing because it's expensive. When interest rates are low, borrowing increases because it's
Lenders
cheaper.
believe them. You heard of the mortgage
When
crisis?
borrowers promise to repay and lenders believe them, credit
Lenders
is
are too easy
created.
to believe. What's their incentive?
Any two people can agree to create credit out of thin air. That seems simple enough, but credit is tricky because it has different names. As soon as credit is created, it immediately turns into debt. Debt is both an asset to the lender and a liability to the borrower. In the future, when the borrower repays the loan plus interest, the asset and the liability disappear and the transaction is settled. So why is credit so important? Because when a borrower receives credit, he is able to increase his spending. And remember, spending drives the economy. This is because one person's spending is another person's income. Think about it. Every dollar you spend, someone else earns, and every dollar you earn, someone else has spent. So when you spend more, someone else earns more. When someone's income rises, it makes lenders more willing to lend him money because now he's more worthy of credit.
This is something that came to me before when I was making notes on what to say. That right there, this credit-worthy borrower, touches upon one of the fundamental causes of income inequality. Of wealth inequality, not income inequality. The creditworthy borrower had to earn that status through repaying his loans quickly and then spending his loan wisely. Like, this is how he becomes trustworthy and creditworthy. But according to the Matthew principle, success begets success. So once he is creditworthy, it only becomes easier and easier for him to access that capital, which is the money. Therefore, allowing him to make bigger and bigger returns on his investments, and this snowballs and snowballs and snowballs to the point where this creditworthy borrower can access huge amounts of capital. And if you have huge amounts of capital at your fingertips, you can influence huge amounts of things, which then you can have bigger returns from, and all of a sudden you have access to more capital. And so very quickly you can go from you're on the same line to, oh, he just did a bit well, and then it's like compounding kicks in and he's doing amazing, and this guy's here is still just struggling. Because to be the creditworthy borrower, you need to have that access to the capital. Having access to capital is one of the fundamental variables in wealth inequality in the world. And there's a finite amount of dollars within the economy. So every extra dollar that our creditworthy investor gets is one less available to everyone else until more money is reprinted, which then just spoils the party for everyone.
A creditworthy borrower has two things: the ability to repay and collateral. Having a lot of income in relation to his debt gives him the ability to repay. In the event that he can't repay, he has valuable assets to use as collateral that can be sold. This makes lenders feel comfortable lending him money. So increased income allows increased borrowing, which allows increased spending. And since one person's spending is another person's income, this leads to more increased borrowing, and so on. This self-reinforcing pattern leads to economic growth and is why we have cycles. In a transaction, you have to give something in order to get something, and how much you get depends on how much you produce. Over time, we learn, and that accumulated knowledge raises our living standards. We call this productivity growth. Those who are inventive and hardworking raise their productivity and their living standards faster than those who are complacent and lazy.
This is important. This is not a character judgment. It is simply a inescapable truth about the economy. And it's a consequence of the system we live in. You have seen that transactions are at the very base of this entire economic system. Those who put themselves in a position that allows more lucrative and numerous transactions are going to fare much better than those not exposing themselves to the possibility of those same transactions.
But that isn't necessarily true over the short run. Productivity matters most in the long run, but credit matters most in the short run. This is because productivity growth doesn't fluctuate much, so it's not a big driver of economic swings. Debt is, because it allows us to consume more than we produce when we acquire it, and it forces us to consume less than we produce when we have to pay it back. Debt swings occur in two big cycles. One takes about 5 to 8 years, and the other takes about 75 to 100 years. While most people feel the swings, they typically don't see them as cycles because they see them too up close, day by day, week by week. In this chapter, we're going to step back and look at these three big forces and how they interact to make up our experiences. As mentioned, swings around the line are not due to how much innovation or hard work there is. They're primarily due to how much credit there is. Let's for a second imagine an economy without credit. In this economy, the only way I can increase my spending is to increase my income, which requires me to be more productive and do more work. Increased productivity is the only way for growth. Since my spending is another person's income, the economy grows every time I or anyone else is more productive. If we follow the transactions and play this out, we see a progression like the productivity growth line. But because we borrow, we have cycles. This isn't due to any laws or regulations. It's due to human nature and the way that credit works. Think of borrowing as simply a way of pulling spending forward. In order to buy something you can't afford, you need to spend more than you make. To do this, you essentially need to borrow from your future self. In doing so, you create a time in the future that you need to spend less than you make in order to pay it back.
Interesting point here. You might have seen in 2020 there was an unprecedented amount of sort of venture capital money thrown at all these sort of startups. Venture capital money is just another word for credit, basically. You know, it's like people with large amounts of money giving them to people who they think are going to make millions and millions and millions of transactions to the point where that initial money they gave in is going to be worth more to them later on when they take it out. So what Ray's talking about here is how a lot of businesses are operating these days, especially newer businesses, and especially the big ones you've heard about. So, you know, do you know about Uber not being profitable? Like, this is something which isn't as well known as it should be. This enormous, ginormous company, which all of us are familiar with and most of us use, actually doesn't make money. The company is debt fueled, right? So they're in this sort of early cycle here where they're just thriving off all the credit that's been given to them by the various means by which they've collected money, whether through private investment, public investment, loans, whatever. But the idea is that if they keep borrowing and they keep borrowing and they keep spending all this money, now they're going to get to that almost monopolistic advantage over everybody else. And then they're going to be able to start repaying all of that debt because they're going to be making so much money. And then the reason they could make that much money is because you saw the short-term debt cycle. They created more productivity than they could have without the credit.
It very quickly resembles a cycle. Basically, anytime you borrow, you create a cycle. This is as true for an individual as it is for the economy. This is why understanding credit is so important, because it sets into motion a mechanical, predictable series of events that will happen in the future. This makes credit different from money. Money is what you settle transactions with. When you buy a beer from a bartender with cash, the transaction is settled immediately. But when you buy a beer with credit, it's like starting a bar tab. You're saying you promise to pay in the future. Together, you and the bartender create an asset and a liability. You just created credit out of thin air. It's not until you pay the bar tab later that the asset and the liability disappear, the debt goes away, and the transaction is settled.
Nietzsche mustache.
The reality is that most of what people call money is actually credit. The total amount of credit in the United States is about
You hear that? You see that graph? There is multiples more credit, not real money, than there is real money. And he explains why we overconsume. It explains why there are options and then why there is waste. It explains how we can all be fat and still throw away food and still have excess food available, because we are so good at creating so much because of all this credit. If there wasn't credit in the economy allowing businesses to consume beyond their current means, then it wouldn't be possible to have so many different types of orange juice, 20 brands of peanut butter, 50 new car models every year. Credit is the engine of the economy, and transaction is the fuel. Reverse that. Transactions are the engine of the economy, and credit is the fuel.
$50 trillion, and the total amount of money is only about $3 trillion. Remember, in an economy without credit, the only way to increase your spending is to produce more. But in an economy with credit, you can also increase your spending by borrowing. As a result, an economy with credit has more spending and allows incomes to rise faster than productivity over the short run, but not over the long run. Now, don't get me wrong. Credit isn't necessarily something bad that just causes cycles. It's bad when it finances overconsumption that can't be paid back. However, it's good when it efficiently allocates resources and produces income so you can pay back the debt.
And that distinction is, man, it's down to education. Got to understand how it works. There is sorry to pause it there, guys, but there is a scheme here in Sweden, and I'm sure it's the same in many other countries around the world. But it's a text loan. So you can text a number and get access to, say, 1,000 euros, 2,000 euros, I think even up to 10,000 euros. Now, who are the type of people that are getting text loans? Either extremely financially desperate people, and then on the other side, just fucking young guys and girls who are uneducated. This isn't a question of them being stupid, although more often not they are, but it's just a matter of being uneducated because they don't realize that there's this notion of interest. And obviously a text loan is like, 20% monthly compounded interest. Stupid terms that you should never, ever, ever enter into when you're borrowing money. Yet it takes advantage of the uneducated among us. So, this guy here with a pile of debt behind him who just spent all his money on a nice TV and a couch and maybe a car. I mean, fuck. Not a good situation to be in, whereas the guy who spends on other stuff. But we're going to get into that.
For example, if you borrow money to buy a big TV, it doesn't generate income for you to pay back the debt. But if you borrow money to, say, buy a tractor, And right there is the difference between the progress of becoming creditworthy and not. Again, one of the initial things, which is that distinction of wealth inequality. Your creditworthiness, your access to capital, your access to money. It all starts from education. But spending the credit on a tractor is only a worthwhile transaction if you go on to use that tractor. Something that is hard to do, requires education, requires other access to capital, so you can buy the land, so you can plant the crops, so you can irrigate it throughout the year, so you can organize the logistics to have it taken away. It's a big pursuit that requires a lot of effort, a lot of time, a lot of education, a lot of knowledge, a lot of hard work, quite frankly. But that access to the capital makes it all possible, right? So it's not easy to do. It requires effort, but if you can do it, then it's an amazing way to spend money. A much easier thing to do would be, I just get this loan, I go out and buy a TV, I go on a nice vacation, like I said with the Swedish credit loans just a moment ago,
People take out the loan, go to Thailand, come back, have spent all their money, and then get a knock on the door like, hey, you owe us like X amount of money plus interest. And like, what the fuck are you talking about? I thought I just have to pay that back, when I'm about to die. Their idea is that they actually never get to pay it back. It's a short-term spike in your utility and satisfaction, but it's not a smart thing to do. The economic machine is a game, okay? So you have to understand how to play it. Whether it's and you can make the moral case for it that's right or wrong, but for me, I just think that's a waste of time arguing, because the reality is we exist within this economic machine. And so learn how to play its game, and then you can perhaps win at it. So all we have is the decision to all we have is to decide what to do with the time that is given to us, Fredo. But all we have is the decision whether to learn about and try and play the game or not. We can learn the rules that distort things in our favor, or we can just sit around and complain that things are not fair and billionaires are all evil people and they should all have their money taken from them. And this game is too unfair and it's too hard to play, and therefore I don't want to be involved in it anymore. Sure, like you can go down that route, absolutely. But it's going to be a tough one. It's a tough one to go down.
Tractor lets you harvest more crops and earn more money, then you can pay back your debt and improve your living standards. In an economy with credit, we can follow the transactions and see how credit creates growth. Let me give you an example. Suppose you earn $100,000 a year and have no debt. You are creditworthy enough to borrow $10,000, say on a credit card. So you can spend $110,000 even though you only earn $100,000. Since your spending is another person's income, someone is earning $110,000. The person earning $110,000 with no debt can borrow $11,000, so he can spend $121,000 even though he has only earned $110,000. His spending is another person's income, and by following the transactions, we can begin to see how this process works in a self-reinforcing pattern. But remember, borrowing creates cycles, and if the cycle goes up, it eventually needs to come down. This leads us into the short-term debt cycle. As economic activity increases, we see an expansion, the first phase of the short-term debt cycle. Spending continues to increase and prices start to rise. This happens because the increase in spending is fueled by credit, which can be created instantly out of thin air. When the amount of spending and incomes grow faster than the production of goods, prices rise. When prices rise, we call this inflation. The central bank doesn't want too much inflation because it causes problems. Seeing prices rise, it raises interest rates. With higher interest rates, fewer people can afford to borrow money, and the cost of existing debts rises. Think about this as the monthly payments on your credit card going up. Because people borrow less and have higher debt repayments, they have less money left over to spend. So spending slows. And since one person's spending is another person's income, incomes drop, and so on and so forth. When people spend less, prices go down. We call this deflation. Economic activity decreases, and we have a recession. If the recession becomes too severe and inflation is no longer a problem, the central bank will lower interest rates.
And this is actually what's been happening around the world for quite a while now. I don't know exactly when it started, whether it's 10 years or less, but famously started with this thing they called Abenomics after Shinzo Abe, the Japanese prime minister or president, whatever he is, chairman, emperor. Interest rates went to almost zero in his country, and there still wasn't a stimulation in economic activity, because what's the idea? If you make money really cheap, you incentivize people to take it and spend it, create the transactions, create the economy. But even with interest rates so low, there still wasn't spending, so they created this thing called quantitative easing. Now, I really don't understand it fully, so I'm not even going to try and explain it, but the idea is that even when interest rates are zero, if there's still not stimulation, this notion of quantitative easing can kind of create some sort of stimulation. And that's also what then trickled over into the Netherlands and my mate Valerio, who bought 110% of his house on loan. I mean, this is crazy stuff. But this has actually kind of been the situation around the world for a while. They've been trying to stimulate growth, and even zero interest rates haven't been the solution. I think the general take on quantitative easing is that it's definitely not sustainable, which kind of means if we're in a world where zero interest rates and quantitative easing aren't going to stimulate spending, big crashes soon, bruh.
To cause everything to pick up again. With low interest rates, debt repayments are reduced and borrowing and spending pick up, and we see another expansion. As you can see, the economy works like a machine. In the short-term debt cycle, spending is constrained only by the willingness of lenders and borrowers to provide and receive credit. When credit is easily available, there's an economic expansion. When credit isn't easily available, there's a recession. And note that this cycle is controlled primarily by the central bank. The short-term debt cycle typically lasts 5 to 8 years and happens over and over again for decades. But notice that the bottom and top of each cycle finish with more growth than the previous cycle and with more debt. Why? Because people push it. They have an inclination to borrow and spend more instead of paying back debt. It's human nature. Because of this, over long periods of time, debts rise faster than incomes, creating the long-term debt cycle. Despite people becoming more indebted, lenders even more freely extend credit. Why? Because everyone thinks things...
This is a great little moment here from Dalio. Look, we don't, as a species, look into the future that well. Businesses can only ever see the next quarter, or they can only ever see the next week. The restaurant can only ever plan for the next weekend. Politicians can only see into the next 4 years. Parents can only look to the next school year. Everyone's emotional state more or less dictates their short-sightedness. Now, money managers, people like Ray Dalio and famous investors and non-famous investors around the world, are in a very privileged situation where they're financially secure and their competitive edge comes from how well they look into the future, right? So they're in a great situation where they look forward as far as they can, and they can maybe take a step back from what we all experience in our emotional day-to-day. Personally, I'm just thinking about, what do I have to do next week? What is my plan for maybe Christmas? Is as far forward as I'm going, and maybe I've got this more macro view back here, but it occupies very little of the time I might spend thinking about things. We all, depending on our emotional state and our incentives, are so short-sightedness, right? But money managers, they're incentivized to be long-sightedness. So that's why these guys tend to have quite fascinating worldviews.
Are going great. People are just focused on what's been happening lately. And what's been happening lately? Incomes have been rising. Asset values are going up. The stock market roars. It's a boom. It pays to buy goods, services, and financial assets with borrowed money. When people do a lot of that, we call it a bubble. So even though debts have been growing, incomes have been growing nearly as fast to offset them. Let's call the ratio of debt to income the debt burden. So long as incomes continue to rise, the debt burden stays manageable. At the same time, asset values soar. People borrow huge amounts of money to buy assets as investments.
Really important point here. Asset and prices soar. What's making them soar? Okay? It's everyone's speculation. Currently in Australia, apparently prices are as high as they've been in about 30 years. Because we've just come out of COVID-19, everyone's gotten this sort of stimulus. A lot of people sort of did well last year. A lot of people sort of moved out of the city. A lot of factors are converging to a point where speculation has risen the prices of housing once again. Sydney, famously a real estate bubble. This is a really important point to make because it's one of almost the psychology of the economy. This falls a little bit outside of the rational actor within the economic system, because a truly rational actor would say they would look at all the variables and say this is worth that. But none of us are rational. As soon as advertising, as soon as other variables come involved, we become irrational. So I'm like, yeah, it might be worth that, but a lot of other people like it, and hey, it looks really good, and hey, we just got this money, and hey, you really want it, and hey, I know my wife really likes an open kitchen. It's like, okay, shit, now I'm willing to pay 10% more, 15% more. Hey, last year was really good. Fuck it, let's go 25% more than it was before. There's a myriad of phenomena that going to influence speculation. Anyway, it's a very important point that Dalio makes here, and I just want to double click on it and double down on it here, because the asset prices are soaring because of everyone's experience and perception of the market. Things are so good. I can afford to spend more in this house. Everyone in my office got a promotion last year. Our sales were doubling fucking week on week. It's unbelievable, you know? Wow, there's a lot more security when you make these big financial decisions. The neighbors just sold their house for 20% more than it was valued just a few weeks ago. My house is probably worth more as well. Maybe I should sell. Maybe I should upgrade, you know? What can I do with all this extra money? Maybe I should go on a holiday. It justifies a lot of confidence and more borrowing. So this is like the speculative fun boom of a bubble that's coming, because this is all in speculation. This isn't based off the fundamental value of things, and that means things are overpriced. But I'm going too far ahead. That's kind of foreshadowing.
Causing their prices to rise even higher. People feel wealthy. So even with the accumulation of lots of debt, rising incomes and asset values help borrowers remain creditworthy for a long time. But this obviously cannot continue forever. And it doesn't. Over decades, debt burdens slowly increase, creating larger and larger debt repayments. At some point, debt repayments start growing faster than incomes, forcing people to cut back on their spending. And since one person's spending is another person's income, incomes begin to go down, which makes people less creditworthy, causing borrowing to go down. Debt repayments continue to rise, which makes spending drop even further, and the cycle reverses itself. This is the long-term debt peak. Debt burdens have simply become too big. For the United States, Europe, and much of the rest of the world, this happened in 2008.
I love the animation.
It happened for the same reason it happened in Japan in 1989 and in the United States back in 1929.
Just to double down on that point there, guys, you've all seen The Big Short. You understand why he just saw that steep linear increase into, well, not linear, but that steep increase into 2008. That's all this speculation. That's the stripper owning 5 houses. That's Tim Dillon as a mortgage broker going around and getting the server at his diner, selling him a house at the table. It's the hyper optimistic speculation of the future, which eventually overinflates all of the asset prices. And we all know what happened in 2008. Massive crisis, massive bursting of the bubble, as it were, almost shut down the whole global economic system.
Now the economy begins deleveraging. In a deleveraging, people cut spending, incomes fall, credit disappears, asset prices drop. Banks get squeezed.
Squeezed is less people borrowing money, therefore less demand for their services, therefore harder for banks to actually make money.
That's the feed on itself the other way. As incomes fall and debt repayments rise, borrowers get squeezed. No longer credit-worthy, credit dries up, and borrowers can no longer borrow enough money to make their debt repayments. Scrambling to fill this hole, borrowers are forced to sell assets. The rush to sell assets floods the market at the same time as spending falls. This is when the stock market collapses, the real estate market tanks, and banks get into trouble. As asset prices drop, the value of the collateral borrowers can put up drops. This makes borrowers even less creditworthy. People feel poor. Credit rapidly disappears. Less spending, less income, less wealth, less credit, less borrowing, and so on. It's a vicious cycle. This appears similar to a recession, but the difference here is that interest rates can't be lowered to save the day. In a recession, lowering interest rates works to stimulate borrowing. However, in a deleveraging, lowering interest rates doesn't work because interest rates are already low and soon hit 0%, so the stimulation ends. Interest rates in the United States hit 0% during the deleveraging of the 1930s and again in 2008. The difference between a recession and a deleveraging is that in a deleveraging, borrowers' debt burdens have simply gotten too big and can't be relieved by lowering interest rates. Lenders realize that debts have become too large to ever be fully paid back. Borrowers have lost their ability to repay and their collateral has lost value. They feel crippled by the debt. They don't even want more. Lenders stop lending, borrowers stop borrowing. Think of the economy as being not creditworthy, just like an individual. So what do you do about a deleveraging? The problem is debt burdens are too high and they must come down. There are 4 ways this can happen. 1, people, businesses, and governments cut their spending. 2, debts are reduced through defaults and restructurings. 3, wealth is redistributed.
I love how the fat guy is the rich one with a big moustache. Such a caricature. Why isn't he pale white, full of sunscreen and lizard looking? And looks like he's 10. These fat cats don't exist anymore. I fucking wish they did. That idea of redistributing wealth, I mean, is it done through taxes? That's the idea of it. You guys want to listen to a great book, Treasure Island by Nicholas Shaxson. You'll get to learn about the fucked up underground world of tax evasion. These big boys they're not redistributing their wealth through taxes.
From the haves to the have-nots. And finally, 4, the central bank prints new money. These 4 ways have happened in every deleveraging in modern history. Usually, spending is cut first. As we just saw, people, businesses.
Sorry, just another point of the redistribution of wealth. Say, for example, last year in the coronavirus pandemic, across the world, there were loads of stimulus bills that were passed. Now, this is money from the government given to the hands of the people. Now, if the rich had paid taxes that was then redistributed to the people, then it would be a redistribution of wealth from the rich to the poor, but it wasn't that. The government borrowed money, printed more money. They did not get it from rich people. And so that means whatever money was redistributed, it sort of came out of thin air. Not from the rich.
And even governments tighten their belts and cut their spending so that they can pay down their debt. This is often referred to as austerity. When borrowers stop taking on new debts and start paying down old debts, you might expect the debt burden to decrease. But the opposite happens. Because spending is cut, and one man's spending is another man's income, it causes incomes to fall. They fall faster than debts are repaid, and the debt burden actually gets worse. As we've seen, this cut in spending is deflationary and painful. Businesses are forced to cut costs, which means less jobs and higher unemployment. This leads to the next step. Debts must be reduced. Many borrowers
it's amazing.
Find themselves
you see how
unable
everything
to
is
repay their
connected.
loans.
Truly
And a
is
borrower's
one
debts are a lender's
never-ending
assets.
set of dominoes.
When a
The
borrower
economic
doesn't
machine.
repay the bank,
Both
people
up and
get
down.
nervous that the bank won't be able to repay them, so they rush to withdraw their money from the bank. Banks get squeezed, and people, businesses, and banks default on their debts. This severe economic contraction is a depression. A big part of a depression is people discovering much of what they thought was their wealth isn't really there. Let's go back to the bar. When you bought a beer and put it on a bar tab, you promised to repay the bartender. Your
Nietzsche's
promise became an asset of the bartender. But if you break your promise, if you don't pay him back and essentially default on your bar tab, then the asset he has isn't really worth anything. It has basically disappeared. Many lenders don't want their assets to disappear and agree to debt restructuring. Debt restructuring means lenders get paid back less or get paid back over a longer time frame or at a lower interest rate than was first agreed. Somehow, a contract is broken in a way that reduces debt. Lenders would rather have a little of something than all of nothing. Even though debt disappears, debt restructuring causes income and asset values to disappear faster, so the debt burden continues to get worse. Like cutting spending, debt reduction is also painful and deflationary. All of this impacts the central government because lower incomes and less employment means the government collects fewer taxes. At the same time, it needs to increase its spending because unemployment has risen. Many of the unemployed have inadequate savings and need financial support
Where's the money
from the
come
government. Additionally, governments create stimulus plans and increase their spending to make...
On that point, inadequate savings and need financial support from the government. I'm not sure if Dalio touches on this now, but globally right now, we have a situation where many countries around the world have aging populations, which just is to say that there is almost more old people than there are young. And what happens when they all retire? And especially in most European nations, in China certainly, it's different to America where like pensions are almost stipends from the government. The individual doesn't necessarily have to do much about it. They just know that when they retire, they're going to get a certain amount of money. What happens when all of these people retire, start asking for their pension, and the young people aren't producing enough to produce enough tax receipts to fund those pensions? I mean, we're looking at a bit of an economic catastrophe.
Make up for the decrease in the economy. Governments' budget deficits explode in a deleveraging because they spend more than they earn in taxes. This is what's happening when you hear about the budget deficit on the news. To fund their deficits, governments need to either raise taxes or borrow money. But with incomes falling and so many unemployed, who is the money going to come from? The rich.
Borrowing money.
Since governments need more money, and since wealth is heavily concentrated in the hands of a small percentage of the people, governments naturally raise taxes.
Guys, again, now this could just be me. I'm not, Ray Dalio has lived this, and he's one of these fat cats. You got to read Nick Shaxton's book, Treasure Island. I'm not convinced that you can just simply turn the tap up on the rich and they do end up paying more. Or maybe you can, actually, now I'm thinking about it. So you guys might know that the top 0.1%, like the Bezoses, the Zuckerbergs, the fucking Gina Reinhardts of the world, are actually functionally not paying many taxes because they have such a significant amount of money and access to businesses that they can funnel it through all of these tax havens. And then it's people who are really, really rich, but not in the top 0.1%, like just $400,000 a year plus to maybe a band of a couple $1 million a year. They don't have enough resources or access to necessarily evade taxes in the same manner. So they can actually have the taxes turned up on them. And a fun fact is they pay for most of the taxes in pretty much any country that we can think of. In Australia, there's a very small amount of people who earn that ridiculous amount of money who pay most of the taxes. In America, that's certainly the case. In Europe, that's certainly the case. In Sweden, where I am, that's certainly the case. So perhaps that's what he's talking about here. But when we think about the rich, we don't necessarily need to immediately think about Elon Musk and fucking Richard Branson and Chamath Palihapitiya. We can think about guys whose names we don't know of. It's these guys walking around at lunchtime in suits who have really, big, important jobs, supposedly, although they're all dying inside from the poison of bureaucracy, which inevitably infects any organization over a certain size. But they earn a lot of money, right? And they earn bonuses and fucking whatever. These people actually are the ones that pay the majority of your taxes, just so you know. It's like you could apply the Pareto principle to tax. 20% of the people pay 80% of the taxes.
On the wealthy, which facilitates a redistribution of wealth in the economy from the haves to the have-nots. The have-nots who are suffering begin to resent
people
the wealthy
fucking hate
haves.
rich people.
The wealthy haves, being squeezed by the weak economy, falling asset prices, and higher taxes, begin to resent the have-nots.
Viva Cuba.
If the depression continues, social disorder can break out. Not only do tensions rise within countries, they can rise between countries, especially debtor and creditor countries. This
when the
situation
economies fall
can
out,
lead to political change that can sometimes be extreme. In the 1930s, this led to Hitler coming to power, war in Europe, and depression in the United States. Pressure to do something to end the depression increases. Remember, most of what people thought was money was actually credit. So when credit disappears, people don't have enough money. People are desperate for money, and you remember who can print money? The central bank can. Having already lowered its interest rates to nearly zero, it's forced to print money. Unlike cutting spending, debt reduction, and wealth redistribution, printing money is inflationary and stimulative. Inevitably.
And remember, so we're printing more money. An increase in the supply of a supposedly finite good lowers the value for everyone else. Okay, so that's what inflation is in maybe a sentence, if that's even possible. But all of our prices are currently agreed upon by all of us because we sort of know how much this money is worth. And we know how much this money is worth in the context of how much money is sort of out there. More or less. There's bands of variability, but more or less. Diamonds are so expensive because they are apparently very rare and finite. Although De Beers, this Belgian company, probably has maybe hundreds of years of diamond supply that they just sort of don't release to the public to create this illusion of rarity and scarcity. But if I'm in a jewelry shop and I'm looking at a diamond ring, and then a delivery for 100 more diamond rings walks through the door, all of a sudden that diamond ring I was looking at is valued less. Like, this is the value of scarcity, and our money supply is supposed to have a scarcity to it. This is one of the great attractive features of Bitcoin. Supposedly there is a fixed amount. I think it's 100 million Bitcoin. Like, it's fixed. So that scarcity is always going to exist. So we always sort of can confidently say what a Bitcoin might be worth. So I hope that makes sense.
The central bank prints new money out of thin air and uses it to buy financial assets and government bonds.
Literally out of thin air.
It happened in the United States during the Great Depression, and again in 2008 when the United States Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, printed over $2 trillion. Other central banks around the world that could printed a lot of money too. By buying financial assets with this money, it helps drive up asset prices, which makes people more creditworthy. However, this only helps those who own financial assets. You see, the central bank can print money, but it can only buy financial assets. The central government, on the other hand, can buy goods and services and put money in the hands of the people, but it can't print money.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to stimulate
Building
the
roads,
economy, the two must cooperate.
Bridges.
By buying government bonds, the central bank essentially lends money to the government, allowing it to run a deficit and increase spending on goods and services through its stimulus programs and unemployment benefits. This increases people's income as well as the government's debt. However, it will lower the economy's total debt burden. Mm-hmm. This is a very risky time.
Look how this money credit of thin air gets
Policymakers
distributed.
need to balance
it's so sophisticated.
the four ways
it's so
that
amazing.
debt burdens come
Truly.
down. The deflationary ways need to
Policymakers,
balance with
the
the
geniuses of the world.
inflationary ways in order to maintain stability.
That's a really good point, because it's not an exact science, obviously. It's not something that can necessarily be plotted, modeled, and predicted. I don't know how they do it, whether it's just sort of on feel or whatever. But I mean, it's certainly done through models and predictive capabilities like that. But as you know, if you've listened to this channel beforehand, as big admirers of Nassim Taleb, prediction is rather futile. How can you predict a future of infinite possibilities based on your finite experience of the past? But that might be going down too much of a tangent. But I think it's worth noting that it requires super sophisticated heads balancing these sort of unbiased incentives. And I don't know if there's many of those people in government.
If balanced correctly, there can be a beautiful deleveraging.
Oh, beautiful.
You see, a deleveraging can be ugly or it can be beautiful. How can a deleveraging be beautiful? Even though a deleveraging is a difficult situation, handling a difficult situation in the best possible way is beautiful. A lot more beautiful than the debt-fueled, unbalanced excesses of the leveraging phase. In a beautiful deleveraging, debts decline relative to income, real economic growth is positive, and inflation isn't a problem. It is achieved by having the right balance. The right balance requires a certain mix of cutting spending, reducing debt, transferring wealth, and printing money so that economic and social stability can be maintained. People ask if printing money will raise inflation. It won't if it offsets falling credit. Remember, spending is what matters.
Fuck, Ray is
A
good.
dollar of spending paid for with money has the same effect on price as a dollar of spending paid for with credit. By printing money, the central bank can make up for the disappearance of credit with an increase in the amount of money. In order to turn things around, the central bank needs to not only pump up income growth, but get the rate of income growth higher than the rate of interest on the accumulated debt. So what do I mean by that? Basically, income needs to grow faster than debt grows. For example, let's assume that a country going through a deleveraging has a debt-to-income ratio of 100%. That means that the amount of debt it has is the same as the amount of income the entire country makes in a year. Now think about the interest rate on that debt.
Underlying all of this is the idea of a fundamentally productive populace. And what makes a fundamental populace, it's a lot more than culture. There's a lot of geographical considerations to be made here. So the Depression cannot wipe out your valid production. It should only halt the demand for it, right? So the Soviet Union and Russia did not produce things the rest of the world wanted. So if they were relying on income growth on the other side of a depression, then they would be far less successful at implementing it than any equivalent citation in modern day Australia or the USA or Sweden or even Mexico or New Zealand, or you're getting the gist. Countries that can produce things because of a myriad factors, which we won't get into, but they're mostly geographical, cultural. Let's continue.
Let's say it's 2%. If debt is growing at 2% because of that interest rate, and income is only growing at around 1%, you will never reduce the debt burden. You need to print enough money to get the rate of income growth above the rate of interest. However, printing money could easily be abused because it's so easy to do and people prefer it to the alternatives. The key is to avoid printing too much money and causing unacceptably high inflation the way Germany did during its deleveraging in the 1920s. If policymakers achieve the right balance, a deleveraging isn't so dramatic. Growth is slow, but debt burdens go down. That's a beautiful deleveraging. When incomes begin to rise, borrowers begin to appear more creditworthy. And when borrowers appear more creditworthy, lenders begin to lend money again. Debt burdens finally begin to fall. Able to borrow money, people can spend more. Eventually, the economy begins to grow again, leading to the reflation phase of the long-term debt cycle. Though the deleveraging process can be horrible if handled badly, if handled well, it will eventually fix the problem. It takes roughly a decade or more for debt burdens to fall and economic activity to get back to normal, hence the term lost decade. In closing, of course, the economy is a little bit more complicated than this template suggests. However, laying the short-term debt cycle on top of the long-term debt cycle, and then laying both of them on top of the productivity growth line, gives a reasonably good template for seeing where we've been, where we are now, and where we're probably headed. So, in summary, there are 3 rules of thumb that I'd like you to take away from this. First, don't have debt rise faster than income, because your debt burdens will eventually crush you. Second, don't have income rise faster than productivity, because you'll eventually become uncompetitive. And third, do all that you can to raise your productivity, because in the long run, that's what matters most. This is simple advice for you, and it's simple advice for policymakers. You might be surprised, but most people, including most policymakers, don't pay enough attention to this. This template has worked for me, and I hope it will work for you.
Rule 3 as well. I mean, that's for life, though. Right. Thank you, mate. Really unbelievable. Ray Dalio. Such a brilliant communicator. He's got principles. He writes on LinkedIn. God knows why he writes on LinkedIn. Take out a fucking domain, mate. You dominate whatever the... Anyway, he is a fantastic communicator, writes very clearly, writes very thoughtfully. This is a guy who has a pretty sophisticated understanding of, Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces. Ray Dalio was in China in the 80s. He's a transcendental meditator. He's a very interesting, obviously incredibly smart, but very good communicator. Cool guy. I really look up to him. I think he's brilliant. And the fact that he provided this 30-minute video for us to learn from is just fucking unreal. So that's it. I hope I didn't bore you. I mean, if you're still here now and I bored you, then you've got some sort of sadistic problem. But cheers for watching. You're a legend. Subscribe to my podcast. It's got nothing to do with economics or Ray Dalio, but you might like it. Ciao.